Basically, for the 699 reporting class this summer, we just tried to come up with a common theme. And knowing that World War I ended 100 years ago, and knowing that our football stadium is a World War I memorial, and knowing that our football stadium is currently in the news for future renovations, I thought, well, this would be a great idea. We'll just find things that happened 100 years ago, tie them into World War I, and then tie them into what's happening today. We took a field trip to Kansas City to the National World War I Museum and Monument, and I think the students had a good time there, getting to go around the museum, talk to the curators, find out a little bit more about the war in general, but then also find out some of the specifics. So,
I'd say before this class, I haven't really thought about World War I since probably middle school when I learned just about generic history. I think I learned a lot that this war has made a lot of impacts on our industry, like technology-wise.
I've learned about all the innovations and inventions that originated in World War I and came out of it, like barbed wire, mustard gas, things that I didn't know originally came from there. Even just the involvement of women in World War I and PTSD originating from there as shell shock. I just didn't know it came out of that war specifically.
you didn't know before?
I think the biggest thing I learned about World War I is just kind of the nature of trench warfare and how trench warfare was kind of a segue from wars from older times to basically the modern wars now. So in World War I, you start seeing new technologies that are basically becoming what is used in war today, and just a lot of like what becomes of modern war.
One thing that I have learned about World War I that I did not know before is a lot of our everyday habits do come out of what has occurred during that period of time. And so there's just a lot of things that we use and do and think every day that have come out of that you wouldn't think it would live so long.
Name one thing. Be specific.
One thing I learned about World War I is passports were created. A bunch of things such as passports, camouflage, stuff like that are pretty common nowadays. I had no idea those were kind of invented around that time.
Each student ended up picking one particular area of World War I and researched it for 6 or 7 weeks and found out how it could relate to today. We looked for sources that were relevant or could be experts on how the innovations and the things that happened 100 years ago affect students today.
I looked up and found that prescription drugs like the prescription opiates were being used in World War I and World War II for soldiers, but then the illicit version of those drugs became really expanded upon in the Vietnam War and were used frequently by soldiers there. But the United States started drug screening around the Vietnam War, and since then illicit drugs have been impossible for soldiers to use without losing their jobs.
So what I want to go through with passports is essentially how people would go from country to country and keep their personal paperwork versus how we've kind of transitioned into it now. And some of the things that I've learned from that research is there really wasn't a whole lot of any kind of paperwork that you had to do. Essentially, ships would just make a list of their passengers and the king or queen would sign it off, and that was your way in.
As a journalist, that's what I'm interested in, is the cross sections between popular culture and politics. Obviously war is a huge part of that, and looking at those things in conjunction with one another and how it impacts society during that time. Even if you were at home, Flanders Fields, the poppies, they didn't have a symbolism then. That's something that's kind of evolved over time, and it came from that war. So even though that's something that has a big impact today, that's not necessarily what was happening then.
So I'm kind of focusing on women and their role in World War I, and kind of what they did has really changed today. In the military, a lot of stuff from World War I is still kind of coming up, and a lot of issues that they've had kind of dates back to World War I and kind of their limitations of women.
Passion is sports, so when I was put up to the topic of what I should do for my story, Memorial Stadium was the thing that first came to mind. I didn't really know that Memorial Stadium was a World War I memorial until this class, and I think it's very interesting.
Because history repeats itself. I think that even going to the World War I museum, we saw things that we see now, or repeated like propaganda and posters, or trying to get things that came from the government or people trying to sway just from posters that you have had no idea came from a certain entity or a certain group to sway your opinion one way or the other. And talking to people about what my enterprise story is about, which is protests, and how they're just little things influence people, like people standing up on Wesco Beach at KU. That goes back to World War I and when people would protest.
So I chose to research PTSD. Back then it was called shell shock, and so I was interested to know how the soldiers dealt with that, how their leaders dealt with those soldiers. And to my surprise, they were looked at as cowards. They were just not treated well. They just kind of were left to deal with it themselves.
My enterprise story is focusing on the service dogs, but in like the police force. And we know from like research that has come out about like animals in the military who've come back with like stress and PTSD disorders, but nobody really ever talks about like police dogs, because they serve almost the same capacity as military dogs, but nobody like really ever thinks about, do these animals have stress from, like they can't just settle down once they get off for a shift, like they're not humans, they can't just talk to someone and unwind.
So what you'll see on this website, 9 students, they each picked a specific area. They also wrote some other stories that had to do with the 4th of July and anything that we could do to tie World War I and events from 100 years ago into today's issues.